Can you guys hear me in the back okay? Yeah, great. Well, thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Very excited to talk to you about, right, as you see, culture change. I'm going to give you, just as a little highlight, we're going to go through kind of why it matters, and then I'm going to give you some examples of what culture change looks like, or at least how the Center for Open Science is thinking about it. And again, for those that aren't aware, we're a nonprofit that's based in the United States. So first I want to kind of frame, I think I'm going to give you a little bit of like the high level of what we're trying to achieve. To me, it also really embodies what we at the Center for Open Science are trying to do when we're trying to advance open science or open scholarship. And that is to take a big step back. And I know some of you have seen this, so you're going to have to bear with me, but to take a step back and ask, why are we doing research in the first place, and what do we value when we do research? And this is a good way to think about that from the Mertonian norms, right, described back in 1940s of what are those norms of science? What are those things that we value as a community? And so Robert Merton described that as what you see there in the norms, right? We're about sharing and evaluating research on its merit and really trying to discover, trying to learn something new. I know that is my big motivating factor for why I always wanted to be a scientist. And I'm skeptical of myself, right? That's self-awareness. And then the counter norms are essentially that opposite, right? It's almost the counter opposite of it. And even though Robert Merton didn't describe it, I definitely kind of describe it this way as quality over quantity. Okay, so this is good. We can get into the philosophical part, but the reason to show that is to think about how the research community wrestles with what we value in terms of what is important for us and holding us together as a research community. And this is an old example, but a good example from Anderson and colleagues, where they were asking NIH researchers, so US-funded researchers, and you can gently ignore the mid and early career. It doesn't matter too much for this conversation. But they asked these researchers, well, looking at those norms, which one do you subscribe to? Which one do you believe more in terms of your value system? Those norms, those that I described to you, or the counter norms? And what you see here is that there's these 85, 90% in that gray bar is saying, yes, I subscribe and I value those Mertonian norms. That hash just says, no, I value both. And that tiny sliver of black says, no, I value the counter norms over the norms. So not very exciting. And all it says is, well, good job, Robert Merton. What you just described back then, people still believe today. So then Anderson and colleagues said, well, don't tell me what you believe. Tell me what you do when you practice your research, when you're conducting your research, right? What do you actually do in that practice? And what you see here is that they're evaluating their own behavior. There's a little bit of encroachment of counter norms playing a role, but more or less there's alignment, right? Okay, I have this belief system. When I practice it, I am trying to practice that belief system. And yeah, maybe the counter norms play a role, but by and large, there's alignment. I value, I practice. So then Anderson and colleagues said, well, don't tell me what you do, tell me what everyone around you is practicing. You know, how are your colleagues down the hall? And it flips, right? They're practicing those counter norms. And so this to me is like really important because it kind of hits two big important dimensions of the system that we're trying to tackle. One is we do have a norm system that we largely believe and that we largely believe we are doing, want to do. And we can't see that we're not doing it, right? We can't see that bias in ourselves. And at least in the academic system, a big piece of that is that incentive system, right? My career advancement, what I do to kind of facilitate research is driven by getting it published, getting that paper, that currency, not necessarily getting it right, which is what I want to do. So we'll come back to that. But first I want to show you, like, does this matter, right? Does it matter? Does it matter that we have this tension outside of just the ideological aspects of it? And I'll give you an example. This is a project in my discipline, prior discipline, in preclinical cancer research. And this is a large 8-year replication project. And this is kind of a summary result of that. Kind of on that bottom x-axis is the original effect size of papers that were published in these quote unquote high profile journals, Nature and Science and Cell. And on the y-axis there is what we found in the replication. So in an ideal world where our research is really reliable and robust, I would expect everything to kind of run across that diagonal line. And instead you're seeing that the vast majority of the findings are dipping below it. And what that means is that, as you can see in the title, that those effect sizes in the replication are, at least in this study, we found it to be 85% smaller than the original findings. So I'm going to translate that a different way in my own terms and what it meant in an experiment. It'd be like having this really exciting preclinical finding where you have an animal model, that you're using to test a drug intervention, and you're doing control versus treatment. And in that original finding, you saw that there was a 20-day difference in survival. And for a mouse, that's huge. That's a really exciting big finding. That's probably going to be something we should translate and move up to the clinic and see if it has an impact in humans around us. And what I just told you is that in the replication, it's 3 days. It's a 3-day difference. And so now you might ask, well, should you move that to the clinic? Like 20 days seemed pretty impressive, but 3? Does that have the same value? And I think this is why we want to think about adjusting the system to get closer to aligning our values with our practices. Before I go on to kind of get back to kind of a meta level, we'll stay here in this project and ask, well, yes, Tim, that's great, or not great, that it was down by 85%. Why? Why did that happen? And I want to show you just briefly here that there are actually simple things why it didn't happen. So this is an articulation of all the projects that we designed and about whether we were able to identify the data that was used, or the analysis that was reported, or the code that was shared, or the reagents, the materials being transferred with each other. And if you look through this whole thing, you'd expect to see if it was a really good sharing, open, transparent system, you'd see lots of kind of those greens coming through. And instead, you actually sadly see a lot of reds coming through, right? We're not sharing the data. We're not sharing our materials. I'm not telling you how I did my analysis. Not even helping you sometimes. And that is low-hanging fruit. This is what we can do to change our culture, which is if I want a more reliable system, I can share more. And again, we can go into a discussion point later of, well, where's the optimal ratio, right? When does it become a burden versus when does it become a benefit? I would argue, just based on these 2 slides that I showed you, we're doing amazing work, and I showed you high inefficiency in the system. So I take the view, we can probably change this and make it better. And this is also, these kind of larger issues have been described before in the past. Again, you can read these, but the real point is down at the bottom, the citations. These citations I'm giving you are from, again, the 60s, the 70s. We need higher sample sizes, right? We need more rigor. Oh, there's publication bias, only positive results. It's really getting us. And there's a list of these that have been described for quite a while. Those same papers tell us what to do. Let's do those replications, right? Let's really think about what did we plan versus what did actually occur and where did we explore, right? That replication has value, I see it at least. So why are we still here, right? Why do we still have this problem? Why did I do a study not that long ago and I saw problems that just is a manifestation of what we knew back in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s? And a big piece of that is that, yes, it's great to describe the challenges in an academic paper. It's great to articulate the solutions in an academic paper, but there's a big difference between writing an academic paper and implementing change. And that latter part, I think, is really where we need to focus, which is what does it mean to implement, an approach that will actually lead to the solutions having effectiveness, or at least leading to testing whether they are effective. And some of it actually is really trying to think about what's that strategy? What is our approach to trying to change this? And again, we can, just like I said, well, what's going on? What should we do, right, in a broad scope, education? How do we tell you? I showed you guys should all change, right? I just changed your minds, didn't I? You guys are now gonna all go back and practice rigorous open science. That's not enough. It's not enough to tell you that you should change and show you the evidence to change. They're necessary by all means, but they're not sufficient in the process. So we need to add more to that. We need to think about that incentive system. You're human. You're going to do what you're incentivized to do. So if those incentives are not aligned between our values and our practices, I don't care how hard you try, there's a good chance you're going to drift back to pragmatic solutions. And we need to make sure we can make it possible. Don't tell me just to share data. Make sure that I can do it, that it's actually a possible solution. So this actually kind of leads to how do we implement this change? And there's one more challenge I want to introduce before I show you kind of a strategy here, which is science at large is decentralized at a whole, right? We have universities, we're in one. We have a publishing system. We have funders that support our work, societies that kind of hold us together. And as a researcher, I am part of this social system that has influences by all these actors, but they're not per se in concert. They don't work together, right? This institution has researchers made up of many disciplines, supported by many funders in many societies. So how do you synchronize all that? How do we put all that together? And so I'm getting closer to showing you some examples of what that means. And really it's to articulate our own strategy of how we do this. So this is, for those that have seen this, right, this is this strategy that we've kind of articulated. Brian Nosek, our CEO, has written about this, of trying to think about how you implement culture change. And the key parts I want to illustrate here is kind of like what are the components that are necessary. So we have to first make it possible, right? You want me to change my behavior, you want me to share my data, make sure that there's a way to do it. It's not enough just to tell me that there's a way to do it, try to make it easier for me, right? That user experience is really, really helpful. It's really hard to change if it's like, becomes compliance and it becomes box checking. So let's reduce that and find ways to make this a lot easier. And even if I change myself, as I just showed you before in Anderson and colleagues study, I need to see it around you. I need to see that it's happening, because otherwise it's really hard for me to know like, oh, great, I'm the one doing this, but I don't see any of my colleagues behaving a different way. Like I said, we have to align that incentive system, and policy has a role here, right? Policy that is making it required is helpful. This pyramid's interesting, right? It seems to indicate that there's a direction to it, and it really doesn't. It really says that they're interdependent, right? These things all have a relationship to each other. And again, the examples I show will do it, but I want to make sure you guys retain that. It's not about just put a policy. It's saying a policy is dependent upon the rest. So none of these are sufficient on their own. They're all necessary, and they're kind of dependent upon each other. There's another aspect to the way that we think about when, at least at COS, when we're thinking about implementing this theory of change, and it's how it diffuses, how it occurs. And so we draw from another one. This is the diffusion of innovations. Again, you can see this is Rogers in 1963. And this is talking about technological innovations, right? We think about the technology around us. I'm sure in this room now, we probably all have smartphones. You have to think back of like, well, when that first happened, how did that move through the system? You had some early innovators, people who were willing to try something, even if it was clunky. I still have the original V1 iPod. If someone wants to buy it, very happy to share it with you. It's very exciting to look at it. Very few people had it, right? It wasn't until it became actually easier where you started getting this adoption to where it became normative. Now it's dead. We don't need it. We don't use our iPods anymore. But at the time, it very much followed this curve of everyone was kind of willing to try it, but it took a while until you kind of got to that majority approach. And there's lots of sociological aspects of how this spreads that I won't get into. The reason I want to share it is we think it's the same concept in terms of pushing innovation into the research culture. That we need to remind ourselves that if we're trying to innovate new practices, new policies, new approaches to research, we should follow that same approach. Don't expect it to occur all at once. A one-size-fits-all is a great way to fail. Instead, we need to try some innovators who are willing to try a new practice, a new behavior, see if we're willing to change that system, iterate, fail, and then see if we can grow that adoption into the early and then mainstream, and then eventually become standard practice, become something we do all the time. So if we're going to change the culture, we should remind ourselves, you don't run to standard. You have to iterate through that process. So again, I'm going to go through these. This slide is just to remind myself I showed you two things. It's very easy to want to map them together, to say, oh, well, the innovators and the standard, these must be related to technology making it possible and policy and making it required. That might be true. You can view it that way. We think maybe there's a relationship. I don't really know. It's more just to show you that these things are playing in concert with each other, right? That the early innovators are probably willing to not worry about making it easy. They're just willing to try it. It's like those early iPod. I'm willing to try this because I think it's cool. And I give you, actually just what we learned in the session before, which is I will give you feedback to iterate on that design. So early adopters help us get closer and closer to making it more mainstream. Okay, I'm going to go through 3 examples. The first 2, before I get into this one's on preprints, is going to be at the very high abstract level in terms of like really the ecosystem at large. The third example I give you, I'm going to try to make it a little bit more concrete in terms of a structured, like more highly controlled environment. That'll make more sense in a bit, but just to preface this. So right, we'll do preprints first. And for those that don't know, right, preprints is the manuscript that authors share before they submit to the journal for peer review. For those not in the life sciences or social sciences, working papers for econ, that's a pretty common term. So if we look at the growth of preprints, working papers over time, this is just kind of drawing on it's a bit old, but some data from a citation database. You can see that there's been pretty good growth over the years. Again, not just to qualify, this is still a drop in the bucket compared to what publication of papers is, but you still see that there's nonlinear growth that's occurring. And you can see these kind of high elements of different disciplinary aspects. And what's interesting is that even though for those that are familiar in this space, we know that at least in econ and in some areas of physics, there's been a higher growth and adoption. You see that the life sciences, which is again like my background, there's been more of a recent growth in what's been going on there. So that's the part that I'm going to use as a case study of, well, why did that happen? Why did around 10 years ago, why did it start to grow? What's causing this? And again, we'll never know, so we can speculate. So we'll speculate right now. And we'll speculate with that model. So we're gonna see if this holds, and you guys can question and tell me if I'm doing a good job or not, or if you believe it or not. One is making it possible. So again, if we want to do preprints, it's not enough just to be like, go do preprints. You have to make sure you have the infrastructure that's in place. And these are examples of a variety of sources, and particularly in the life science, a big change was bioRxiv, a preprint repository that was for life scientists. So when they decided to build their own infrastructure and brand it as bioRxiv, even though arXiv existed, it allowed that community to say, I have a home. I have a place to go. And of course, that continues to grow, right? medRxiv is for the kind of clinical health side, application side of the life sciences. So it said, I have a home. And you can have homes in different ways, right? Whether that is regional in terms of the African continent or whether it's discipline. So this makes it possible. It gives me a home. I know what to do now. I go to that server and it helps me deposit my preprint. But we also have to make sure that it's easy to do that. So again, there's examples of this occurring by having the preprint process, like I said, a precursor to the paper being submitted to a journal. PLOS and other publishers have integrated it. So now when you submit to a preprint, say bioRxiv, you can push your paper to publication, or you can do it in reverse. When I submit my paper for peer review at PLOS, they can say, click this box, and we will deposit that manuscript as a preprint. That's great. That means I don't have to go to a separate server. It's just part of my workflow. I'm submitting my paper, click a box, and it goes off and becomes a preprint. The community gets it immediately, and I navigate the peer review route. So this is a really great way of making it easier to do it, right? Versus lots of checkboxes and lots of work. We have to make it normative, right? Like I said, we've got to be able to see each other as we're doing this. A really key part that occurred around 2019, 2018 is a group that basically started really trying to make it a lot more obvious, ASAP Bio that you see here. So ASAP Bio is a nonprofit organization about advancing preprints in the life sciences. So it's a community of practice. They're making it more visible. They have webinars, right? They share, they have toolkits. They even, they used to at least on Twitter/X. I'm sure they still do social media, probably on different platforms. But they make it so that it's visible. They create this community that says, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one submitting a preprint. There's others around me that are doing it. And so this, I think, is a really key piece to that growth curve. In terms of making it rewarding, the same thing occurs in terms of who, in this case, these are examples of funders, one here in the, not here, but one in the UK, one in the US, in terms of the funders shifting this, not as a policy, just as an opportunity, right? Saying, when you submit your grants, yes, you're welcome to put preprints down as a research object. That's a game changer, right? Now there's an incentive for me to do it. I now get to show you my work because the funder says when you submit a grant, I can put a preprint down. So it's not this like fictitious cool object that only those open science advocates do. It is a way for me to show my productivity. There's something that gets back to me besides just doing it because I think it's good. I get a reward. I get to look good in my productivity when I'm submitting a paper to a grant, especially the big grant suppliers. And then in terms of making it required, here's a good example from the journal eLife in the UK, where they shifted their policy not that long ago to say, no. Unlike that model I showed you before with PLOS, which is submit to my journal, click the box, becomes a preprint, they say everyone that you submit, everybody who submits to our journal, they all are preprints. So when you submit to our journal, by default, you are making your paper a preprint. It's a requirement. And so that's a really extreme example of making sure, like, can we really push this far by just making it a policy when you submit to this journal. And so anyways, this is just a short case example of with preprints in the life sciences, how those kind of aspects occur. I'd be naive to think, right, this is great. Look, it's so easy, right? There are challenges and they'll continue to persist in terms of challenges. Some of those are just very technical, right? It's still hard to discover preprints, right? We know that. It's not integrated in our search discovery platforms, right? PubMed is a big platform for this. They don't index preprints. So that needs to change. It's really hard to find that. Preprints are designed to version over time. People don't quite understand how that works, and the platforms don't really quite have that sorted out. And of course, there's still emerging infrastructure that does a pretty good job, but it's very human author dependent in terms of linking the preprint to the finished paper. This is not good. We're creating, bad duplication. And part of that is the lack of key metadata. And there's more, right? There's more aspects. And some of it is just social, right? It's back to this point of, yes, it's growing, but the community's still struggling. Like, is this good? Is there enough benefit to outweigh the risk? Are those risks real? This fear of scooping? What if I submit a preprint and somebody else comes along and gets my idea and gets to the paper before I do? I lost my reward, the paper, because I did this practice preprinting. And it's a fear. It doesn't have to even be real to be a problem. It's a social fear. It's a perceived fear. And there's a lot more. And one that's interesting, especially in light of, again, like where I was in the previous talk, is licensing, right? What happens if I preprint? Does that hurt my chances to publish because of licensing conflict, right? These are factors that are going to affect it. And these are factors that are going to continue to be evolved, and we're going to hopefully see growth, or maybe you don't see growth because we're not able to change it. Again, when we think about the growth of early adopters to standard. I'm going to have to go faster, I think. Okay, 2 more examples. I'm okay? Okay. Another one, we'll stay up at that high level of pre-registration. So a different practice now. We're going to do this in the social sciences. I tried to pick 2 examples in 2 different plans on 2 different topics just to kind of make sure that I could connect to people. So for those that aren't familiar with pre-registration, right, it's this concept of being able to kind of describe your plan, what you are proposing to do for your study before you do your study or before you analyze your results. And it's meant to kind of reduce these questionable research practices that have been raised and increase transparency at least, which is, I can see more. I can see what you intended to do compared to what you actually report in that paper. So it gives more visibility into the research process. And again, we'll look at another graph here. This is just, again, pulling from a citation database of, well, how often do papers have pre-registration or registration, because the clinical trials use the word registration. How often does that occur over time? And again, this is kind of broken down by some disciplines. And again, in the health sciences, it's largely required now since 2000. So that's that blue bar. There's a good reason for that. It's a requirement. But we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about, again, just like in the life sciences, something is popping out again. We're seeing growth in the social sciences. So that's interesting. Why do we see now growth of pre-registration in the social sciences? All right, so we'll go through the same thing, the same exercise. Well, what's part of it? Part of it is it's possible now. Right? There's platforms, for full disclosure, OSF is managed and maintained by the Center for Open Science, but there are other ones, disciplinary specific again, right? In economics, really showing that there is a way to let people in that community say, I have a home. I can go there and pre-register what I want to do. Very good. It's not, I don't go to clinicaltrials.gov, I go to these places to pre-register. But it's not enough again, just like we talked about, I gotta make sure it's easier. What do I pre-register? I've never done this before. Can you make it easier for me? And a lot of this is workflow. So again, I'll look just at OSF in terms of what we do, which is we don't have it where it's just one way to pre-register. We say, well, what is the type of research that you're doing? Can we create a form that has the metadata, the questions that you should answer that is relevant to you? So if I'm doing qualitative versus quantitative research, I'm going to look at that very differently. And so these templates make it easier for you. It makes it easier for you to be able to navigate the process and select which ones do I think is best based on the type of research that I'm doing. We also, again, want to make sure that we make it normative again. So and again, an example of this in the psychological sciences of normative is how do I know if I'm doing pre-registration, especially since it's not a norm? Well, here's an example where you use badging. We just heard about that again from the last talk. Because badging, when done visibly, lets people see I'm not alone. I look at the paper, and again, this is an example from the Journal of Psychological Science where you see right up front badging along with the abstract. So I can kind of just glance down and be like, oh, interesting. These are papers that have pre-registration. I wonder if that means anything, but it makes it much more visible in terms of, oh, that's just a research paper. I have to dig deep into it to figure out if they did or did not do this one behavior. So that helps make it more normative. Rewarding, for those that aren't familiar with this, we're going to integrate how pre-registration actually can get integrated into the research process in terms of the publication process. And a way to do that is this concept called registered reports. So if we think of simplistic peer review, design, conduct, report, publish, typically we only have peer review in that one bubble way off to the right? After I've done my research, when I'm submitting it, that's when peer review occurs, just like I showed you in the preprint example. Registered report says, no, let's come earlier. Let's do it after design. Let's peer review that pre-registration. And if that is of sufficient quality, I will give you in principle acceptance of your results, but I'll peer review it one more time. So the reward here is, if I do a pre-registration and I submit it to this journal that is using this format, then wait, I get my paper before I even did my research because I did a good design, and as long as I maintain my quality, they agree to publishing the results no matter what. And so that's a really interesting way of making pre-registration actually a rewarding thing. Again, that credit, I as a researcher get credit for doing this now. This is just a brief example of showing that, kind of like I showed you in the first graph, that part of this is really the growth curve of making registered reports more accessible in terms of number of journals that are accepting it, and in terms of also the types of formats that are being used. And so at this point, there are, I think, over 300 journals that offer registered reports as a format. And then making it required. So here's two really good examples of two funders, Arnold Ventures and the DAM Foundation, where they require everything that they fund, all their studies, to have pre-registration. It's a requirement of funding. So if I get money from one of these two organizations, they want to see my pre-registration of all the studies that I do. So a good example of, well, great, if we really want to make this normative, we'll have the funder requirement that you have to do this. Okay, again, not being naive, there's challenges here as it's emerging. Kind of similar to before, the discoverability linking is always going to be a problem. Definitely one that's emerging, I think, now, which is, that's great, you pre-registered, but that's a different object compared to this paper. There's slippage, there's alignment. How do I assess another object compared to if you're compliant or not with it in terms of full disclosure of your design versus your report? Because rarely do things go according to plan, and that's the whole point of pre-registration. And then even on the social side, again, same thing, and here you get that same fear, whether it's real or not, of, if I do this practice, it's going to take more time, and is it going to slow me down? And if the whole system is built on how many papers I published, did you just add something to my workflow? Are you slowing me down? Am I not going to be perceived as productive as somebody else that's in my field, which is a real fear that we need to think about. And again, part of that is because it changes the order. It changes the way we think about research. Oh, wait, I have to articulate descriptively what I'm going to do before I do it. Well, full disclosure, I think you do that anyways, but it's hard because now it's formalized, and that's going to be a social thing that's going to really affect adoption. And of course, there's many other beyond these. All right, one more example, I promise, and then I will stop, and then we can go to questions. And this one's the one that is narrow focus, and for your awareness, I'm going to talk about that pyramid in reverse, just because it's a little easier for this. So this is a project that COS is playing a role in helping. It's a global flourishing study, and it's really the parts that we play a role that I want to highlight here is increasing the rigor and transparency, specifically through an action of data access. So this global flourishing study is a longitudinal study that just started recently on human flourishing. Baylor and Harvard in the US are the two institutions that are largely driving this. Gallup, that you might be familiar with on survey assessment, they're collecting the data, and then COS plays the role that I'm going to show you in terms of how we're trying to shift the culture towards, or at least in this project, towards what we want and desire, rigor and transparency of process. But this is kind of what this project is trying to do, and this is essentially what I see as like the collateral. This is what we're going to leverage to see if we can change culture. So how are we going to do that? Well, there's a key feature, which is in order to get the data, we made it a requirement that you have to pre-register. So we're going to start, again, as you can see, I'm going to start from that policy perspective, which is we baked in. You want that data, at least for the first year, we're not just releasing it publicly, we're going to withhold it. We're going to say, in order to get that, we want to make sure that there's good rigor and transparency in this. So to get that data, all you have to do is this simple step, pre-register or do the registered reports format that I just talked about. There's key parts, though, that we elaborated in our policy that I want to kind of cut through, and you can read through this a little bit, but there's certain things that I want to highlight, and you can see that in the numbers, which is it's not just enough to pre-register. It's like, why are we trying to do this? And also, what else do we want and expect? So our goal here for this policy is increasing the rigor and transparency and maximizing the openness and linkage of the objects that you do in your research so that the community can see what's happening. And in our agreements, and this is worth just kind of glancing through, is we are saying, in order to get the data, I agree to pre-register my hypotheses before I get the data. Anytime I want to ask, because it's longitudinal, for another wave, I will have to tell you everything I found from that. The code that I generated and the results that I generated. So we want disclosure of what's going on. Preprint it. Unless there's a reason you can't, you can ask us, but almost all journals now are pretty compliant with preprints. Preprint it. Make sure it's accessible early to the community. And make sure that you're citing that source, that data. Especially, I think, in the social sciences, there's still slippage that occurs in terms of kind of norms around data citation. We want to make sure that the community can understand what actually came from this data set. So let's cite it in a consistent way using a DOI. So these are the big 4 things that we say as a policy. If you want this data, these are the things that we expect you to do. Okay, that sounds scary, right? It's like kind of scary to me just to say it there. And the reason we're willing to try and do this, not just because we believe it, is because we think we've got the rest in place, which is, can I make it rewarding? Well, I just told you, part of making it rewarding is we will just review that pre-registration as long as you meet our minimum standards. That's how you get your data. So we're going to make sure that you get your reward of the data, and we're connecting it, like I said, to the registry reports process. Our goal here is not to make this counter to you getting the credit of publication. We're trying to integrate it into that process as much as possible. So we bake in the registry reports process, and we try to make it easier for you to get that rewarding aspect of, I got data now that I can use for publication. We ourselves also try and work with the other partners in here in terms of trying to make it as normative as possible, in terms of trying to slowly build and support the community interested in this. So we'll give you help resources. We'll give you the documentation you need. We have webinars, right? We make our training materials openly accessible, and we try to really kind of push the envelope and as much as we can of anyone who's engaged in this. How do we make it so it's easier for you to have and see and work with each other in a community, in terms of you just being a single researcher saying, oh, I have to do this brand new process, they're making me do it, and I'm the only one doing it. Here we try to build that community in terms of the hundreds of people interested. How do we let you see each other and learn from the same concepts and give that feedback? We try to make it easy as well. So again, as you would expect, I'd say, yes, we have templates that we use, just like I showed you in the example before. But we also think of sample data resources. If somebody's never done this before and they're afraid and they say, wait a second, this is a really complex data. How am I going to ever pre-register if I don't see the data? So we generated a lot of sample data, simulated data resources to allow people to use that in making their pre-registration a little bit easier for them. So again, trying to make this a lot easier so you're not just going blind into this process, filling out a template that you actually have as much resources as possible to walk you through the expectations of what we believe is necessary for the type of data that you're collecting. And again, we did not generate this ourselves, we generated this with the community, and are always looking to refine this as well. And of course, the last thing is we just make it possible, right? On those 2 fronts that I was talking about. So we have a registry, we have pre-registration, right, possible through the infrastructure. Very specific again, just for this study. We create that community of you can do this, this is the registry that you will use, so that way it's very possible for you to do these practices. And the same thing, I told you, it's not enough to pre-register, you have to connect all these other resources. And so again, we make it possible through the infrastructure that yes, you can connect all these resources. You can connect your data and your preprint, sorry, your code and your preprint to the data and the pre-registration. At least this is our hope. I don't have a next slide, because I don't know how this is playing out, right? So like my reason for showing you this is it's a different way of thinking about it from the abstract, like kind of conceptual level of what's occurring largely in a system to a controlled environment, which is COS being a part of this, which is, within a project, I can still apply this to the smaller community, only a couple hundred people, but I have to think through these norms the same way. So I have no idea if this is gonna work out. We're like just in the beginning phases of this project. Later this year, if I gave a talk, I'd probably have a nice slide of all the challenges that we're encountering. But our goal here is to not just provide the data and hope for the rigor and transparency, is to learn from this process as well through feedback, which is this a good way of trying to really advance change? Or are we just creating too much compliance? So I don't have a last slide like I have with the other 2. But more of a last slide of just reminding you of what I was trying to show you, right? As we're advancing open scholarship, we really do want to be thinking about how do we support that? What are the mechanisms that are necessary? And what do we expect at any given stage, right? Is it just focusing on trying to get proof of concepts? Or where are we in that change curve? And I think that's a big piece of really being iterative in it. We don't want to be blind to feedback. We want that feedback to keep improving our process. So thank you. I think I'm all right on time. And those slides are accessible, and that's my email. And thank you for listening to me.